And with that, we will now move to that second panel. I want to introduce the moderator for this panel, Vanessa Suarez, who is a senior policy advisor with Carbon 180, and she will take the helm at this point. Vanessa?
Thanks so much, Will. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second panel of American University's second annual conference on carbon removal policy and law. In this session today, we will be discussing environmental justice and equity considerations for the carbon removal field. The first hour will be a moderated discussion between myself and the panelists, and the final 30 minutes will be an audience Q&A. My name is Vanessa Suarez, and I am a Senior Policy Advisor for Environmental Justice and Agriculture at Carbon 180, a nonprofit dedicated to advancing equitable and science-based federal policy for the broad portfolio of carbon removal solutions in order to reverse 2 centuries of legacy emissions. Joining me today are Seema Kakade, Dr. Simone Stewart, and Delaney Hughes. Our first panelist, Seema Kakade, is a professor of law and director of the Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Maryland School of Law, where her work focuses on environmental justice, air pollution, and compliance and enforcement. Before joining the faculty at University of Maryland, Seema spent her time as an attorney with 2 federal agencies, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Department of Energy. In the carbon removal space, she has most recently been involved with evaluating environmental justice considerations as part of the worldwide X Prize carbon removal competition. Our second panelist, Dr. Simone Stewart, is the Industrial Policy Specialist for Climate and Energy Policy at the National Wildlife Federation, where she works on carbon capture, utilization, and storage, carbon dioxide technologies, and other strategies to decarbonize difficult to abate sectors. Before joining NWF, Simone received her PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she was a National Science Federation Graduate Research Fellow. During her time at UCSB, Simone also worked as a graduate student for the Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy, where she led a variety of programming and created detailed informational campaigns rooted in the tenets of environmental and economic justice. And our third panelist, Delaney Hughes, is the Director of Solutions, Equity, and Stewardship at the Foundation for Climate Restoration. She leads the organization's Solutions series, in which she writes white papers, blog posts, and video scripts, as well as hosts expert panels to educate the public on carbon removal solutions that have the potential to be scalable, financeable, durable, and equitable. She developed the organization's 4th principle of equity, which provides a framework for analyzing the capacity of carbon removal solutions to be equitable and just, in addition to leading the organization's internal and external JEDI work. Previous to her time with F4CR, Delaney generated community awareness and engagement, along with fundraising support for programs that provided nutritional food, shelter, education, healthcare access, and counseling to assist and empower orphaned and vulnerable children in Mexico and Nicaragua. Welcome to all of our panelists, and thank you for your participation. There's a lot for us to discuss today, so let's dive right in. I'd like for us to start with some background and context setting. Seema, you've done a plethora of work on environmental justice matters in the Maryland and Mid-Atlantic regions, as well as environmental justice work with government agencies and NGOs. To kick us off, could you break down for us what environmental justice is, what climate justice is, as well as give us a background on the environmental justice movement and how it differs from the environmental movement that so many are familiar with?
I'm happy to, Vanessa. And before I start, thank you so much for the invitation to Will and the conference organizers. It's such a privilege to be here. And I really applaud the conference panelists for participating in this really important topic on environmental justice, which I think is just at the forefront of the carbon removal space and really the climate change conversation writ large. So I'm going to start with giving a little bit of a high level thought process behind environmental justice. So My answer, Vanessa, to your question about sort of what is environmental justice, I think it really largely depends on who you're asking and what perspective you're bringing to the table. And I think that's really important to think about, because my view is that environmental justice means different things to different people. I think environmental justice at the federal level in the United States really has focused largely on pollution and the historic movement of environmental justice that people talk about a lot in the United States really began really with the civil rights era in the 1960s, where we really saw a push amongst workers in particular on sanitation issues. And that delved much more into the 70s and 80s with protests specifically focused on additional sanitation and public health issues, moving into the world of hazardous waste, in particular hazardous waste siting. And so a lot of people in the United States will talk about the history of environmental justice as starting most predominantly in the 80s in the context of hazardous waste, in the context of a recognition with some studies that were done on where in the United States hazardous waste facilities are being sited. And a lot of research and study done at that time identified race as the predominant factor for hazardous waste siting. And so then we move into the 90s and the early 2000s with this idea that something seems off here. We are concentrating large pollution sources like hazardous waste in particular kinds of communities. And then we start to see an influx of other communities, many that are race-based or ethnicity-based, that come into the picture for this environmental justice movement that is really taking foot in the United States. Indigenous populations, Latinx populations, other populations are coming in and saying, yes, we have been really talking about some of these issues in non-hazardous waste spaces and all kinds of other spaces as well. And the global movement also comes into picture in the United States, a recognition that some of these concepts of where we are placing our environmental bads is really a global issue and has been a global issue for a long time. And so I think at this point in the United States in the early 2000s, we start to see that while environmental justice is taking root in the United States, it's a larger conversation that is also happening and has been happening globally with multiple other communities. And so really, where are we today? Where are we in the period of time where today? Well, I think in the United States in particular, we've seen a resurgence of a real focus on environmental justice that has corresponded with the movement for Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd. We're starting to see a real strong interest in environmental justice at the federal level in the Biden administration, who's prioritized environmental justice. We're seeing it at the state level, multiple states that are starting to really hone in on this phrase environmental justice. And as a result, I think the notion of environmental and justice has really broadened, right? Whereas environmental, this concept of environmental, which maybe at one point meant specific kinds of pollution, and in other contexts has meant things that are nature oriented, birds and bunnies, like I like to say, right? It's all of it. It is birds and bunnies, it is pollution, but it also has become a lot of other things. This notion of the environment has become things that we recognize that are indoor, right? Like indoor air quality and drinking water that's coming into our homes, right? It also encompasses, I think, access to the environmental goods that we have in the world, being able to access green space, being able to access renewable energy. and be able to reduce our own electricity bills, and who can have access, right? So I think it is become much broader of a concept. And as a result, this term environmental, I think, has taken shape in a lot of other contexts where we talk about not just environmental justice, but water justice, which has a quality concept to it, a quantity concept to it, an affordability concept to it, right? And a recognition that there are lots of different kinds of water. We use it for recreation and we use it for drinking water, and everything in between, right? We also have notions not only of water justice as a subset of environmental justice, but we also have things like food justice as a subset of environmental justice, right? And how do we get our food? Who is entitled to healthy food? How does that relate to soil and soil quality, right? And so there's a large environmental component in the food system, and there is a broader notion of environmental as incorporating food and food systems, much more so now as well, right? And there's also energy justice and climate justice, which I really think of all these fields are subsets of this larger notion of the environment in which we relate to and the environment in which we react to, right? This word justice also has become much more complicated, right? Where we're thinking about justice in lots of different lenses and lots of different angles. We're thinking about justice as a distributional concept, sort of at the local, state, federal, and global levels. Where are the goods and where are the bads going? And where are we concentrating the environmental goods, like access to green space? And where are we concentrating our environmental bads, right? And so there's this concept of distribution overall in the justice-oriented concept. There's also concepts of procedural justice, meaning which people, which communities have access to decision makers. And those could be decision makers in government, could be decision makers in the corporate business sector, right? There's lots of different kinds of decision makers. And so being able to have access to the procedural elements of the way we make decisions about the environment is an aspect of justice as well, right? There's also aspects of justice that relate to restoration and relate to remedying past harm, right? And so there's these elements of justice too that really resonate with healing and with healing processes, right? And with feelings of abandonment and communities that have been abandoned, and how do you repair and how do you restore? And so there are elements of justice that are really wrapped up intimately in concepts of restoration. And so this notion of environmental is much bigger than I think people otherwise, immediately think of. And this notion of justice as well is also quite broad at the point we are in time now. I hope that helps give some framing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving us the foundation for what environment means, what justice means, and what we're referring to when we speak about these concepts in the carbon removal field. I really love how you touched on energy justice, food justice, and all these different types of justice that are now emerging. And I'm sure, as we all know, carbon removal is such a broad portfolio of solutions that it will inevitably touch all of these different sectors and industries and pieces of people's lives. So that being said, Delaney, I would love to turn it over to you. With your recent solution series at the Foundation for Climate Restoration, you've really started to dive deep into the portfolio of carbon removal solutions. Referring to SEMA's different equity considerations and types of justice, could you touch on some of these priority equity considerations across the portfolio of carbon removal solutions? And could you also speak to how some of the current and historical systems of colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy have contributed to these major equity and justice considerations across land and tech-based solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me here today. Very excited to be here with these amazing panelists and our moderator. So within my analysis that I use for different CDR solutions, I like to think of it especially in terms of what Seema alluded to very well, which is procedural justice, distributive justice, and then also reparative justice and transformative justice. So I'll get into the first three, and then maybe we can have time to kind of get into transformative throughout our conversation. But with procedural justice, this is probably what I feel probably the most important right now. So we're in the very early stages of CDR, and we really want to be thinking about how early on we're engaging the communities in which we will have these projects, and really civil society at large. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is really focused on building that education for the average person, the person who's coming not from this field and is not necessarily understanding what CDR means, what these different terms are, and then really also diving a little bit deeper into the specific concepts of justice. So with procedural, you really want to understand the different communities based on their cultures, based on their histories, whether there's environmental justice history within their community is a huge consideration in terms of guiding how you even choose to have a site there and what that means for that community. It's a lot about building trust and meaning behind those relationships, understanding that you need to be adaptive and adjust to feedback within the communities themselves. And then I would also add, in terms of understanding a community, there's also within community differences. So there's a lot of local power dynamics, and there's a lot of opportunities to be subject to elite capture. And so we really want to be thinking about understanding not just the community as a whole, but within the community, who's able to receive these benefits. So it's really all about setting the foundations for that distributive justice that Seema was also alluding to. So one of the things that I like to add is really when you're engaging the communities early on, a lot of these communities are overburdened, especially in predominantly marginalized communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. So ensuring that when you're meeting with them, there's accessible meeting times, accessible formats, locations, it's multilingual. There's opportunities for it to be ADA accessible, to have these materials online. So thinking about all the different barriers in which it might prevent someone who really wants to engage, but might be already overburdened to be able to engage. So already thinking about that early on. And then I'll add last in terms of procedural justice is ensuring that when you're going into a community and you have ideas for a project, that there are definitely alternative options for those communities and really allowing them the final say on that. So we've talked a lot in the past about maybe it's not going to be a direct air capture project. Maybe there's a coastal blue carbon project for this community that actually might provide different types of co-benefits, and really being willing to work with that community and understand them to find what best suits their needs. And then in terms of distributive justice, I really like to think of it as foundational with procedural justice. So in order to be able to distribute those benefits equitably, you really have to understand the community. So setting the foundations is really required through the procedural process. And then you want to be able to have safeguards within, whether it's policy, whether it's a community benefit agreement, a project labor agreement, and really having these accountable mechanisms that ensure when you're distributing these benefits that there's the follow through. And then I would also add understanding what these benefits mean for different communities is super important. So for example, we think a lot about job opportunities as a great benefit for communities, and for predominantly communities that are in fossil fuel producing regions, those communities have had different projects from oil and gas come to them and offer job opportunities as their co-benefit. And that can be problematic in a number of ways, especially when there's low socioeconomic status, right? So you don't want to be able to offer that only option, something that they ultimately have to take because they need jobs. So really working with the community to understand beyond the idea of job opportunities. Or another example I've been learning about recently, which is cleaning up different regions in that area. So some people see that as an obligation, some see that as a benefit, and really understanding what that means for different communities. So the final one I'll add is the reparative justice. And that really goes into the context of climate reparations, which I'm sure we'll get into throughout this conversation. But I really like to always reference Olufemi Taiwo's book, Reconsidering Reparations. He brings it in a distributional context, as Seema really talked about, in terms of the global considerations that you want to think about, and then also in terms of racially advantaged communities versus disadvantaged communities, and who has inherited the moral liabilities of the past wrongdoing, in order to guide how we begin our future in terms of applying reparations within all these different contexts. And I think for that, it's really unique in terms of CDR as an opportunity to not only pay for the cost, but to ensure that we're building in within different policies, different ways to adjust decision-making power, ownership, who has the means and abilities to be involved in this and make the decisions and have the final say. And then in terms of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism, this I could go on for days with, of course, as I'm sure we all can. But I'll try to keep it brief since I want to be able to hear everything that's going on today. So colonialism, this is super important in terms of thinking of Indigenous communities and the role that that has taken in the past, really within the climate justice context and environmental justice context. And for carbon removal, we have solutions that we're talking about in terms of forest carbon practices or regenerative agriculture. And these are different processes and approaches that these communities have been practicing for thousands of years and ultimately are still practicing to this day, but predominantly because of forced displacement and mass genocide and dispossession of their land, have actually not been able to pass on as much as this generational knowledge to their communities today. So if we're going to bring that within the context of CDR, we really want to make sure that we're understanding what those dynamics are in terms of guiding how those communities will get to benefit in the future, and really using that as a guiding light for future deployment. And then capitalism, I'll also reference another book Naomi Klein wrote, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, which can probably go on for hundreds of pages with this. But really, we've seen so much of how capitalism has exacerbated injustices, created injustices, and really put us on this perpetual cycle that can be pretty vicious in terms of this mass production and this mass consumption, and really just this inequitable distribution of benefits. So I think if we're going to design a vision that is equitable and just, we really need to make sure that we're considering how our financial systems have recreated these problems and what we're going to do in the future to provide alternative methods of living and thriving for everyone. And then patriarchy is the final one. So this is, I love talking about this. I know there's like the All We Can Save books and so many women that are just leading the movement. I know there's a statistic in terms of worldwide, women are leading the charge on climate legislation, which I love seeing. But also we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate change. And that is a huge thing to consider in terms of how we're going about solutions and how we're going to keep guiding this environmental and climate justice movement. And we've seen that female leadership fosters connection and listening and collaboration and all these different things that we really ultimately need in terms of ensuring a globally agreed upon and collaborative way of deploying CDR and all the different options for climate action. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much for that rundown, Delaney. And I really appreciate how you spoke to alternatives that can be offered to communities and really taking into account what they want to see in their own communities. So in order to finalize setting the stage, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Stewart. As an expert in the carbon management field, which includes both carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal, could you speak to the conflation that's currently happening, both unintentional and intentional, between these technologies? Do you think there's someone that stands to benefit from some of this conflation that's happening? And why is it important to distinguish between these technologies, both generally when we're thinking about climate goals, as well as when communicating with environmental justice groups and frontline communities?
Yeah, well, firstly, let me start by saying, thank you to everyone for having us on this panel. Preparing for it was really inspiring to talk to my fellow panelists. And so I hope that we can continue this awesome discussion today. I think that really starting a conversation around carbon dioxide removal, it's important to set the stage, as you said, Vanessa, and clarifying terms. And I think that there's a lot of, misinformation out there about what exactly carbon removal is. And so since we're at a CDR conference, I won't dwell on this for too long, but I do think it's important to kind of just go over it briefly, that when we say CCS, or carbon capture and storage, we're typically referring to point source carbon capture, where often the carbon is coming from a flue gas or some kind of source that we can point to. So then we can capture the CO2 there. It can be used in various processes. We can recycle the CO2, or we can store it in geological formations underground. This is a mitigation tactic. And then secondly, CDR refers to the removal of CO2 from the ambient air. And this is much more targeted towards legacy emissions, the historic emissions that we have been putting out over time. And so no matter how much mitigating or decarbonization that we do as a society, eventually eventually it has been established by the International Governmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, that we will need to draw down those legacy emissions in most scenarios in order to meet the 1.5 to 2 degree level. And the caveat with carbon dioxide removal is that many people refer to processes as carbon dioxide removal, but really when we say removal, that means storing carbon dioxide underground. And so that is the only way that we will get to negative emissions, is storing that, but also sometimes in the context of CDR, carbon recycling or reuse is also considered. So just drawing the lines, and it's, kind of to set the stage with what we are talking about going forward, it's really important to understand what we mean when we say particular terms. And so that's where we get into kind of the conflation of terms. So I think that the conflation is both, as you stated, unintentional and intentional. And so unintentionally conflating CCS and CDR, I think happens really frequently in the public sector because of a lack of education and understanding. I think with as big of a mission as we have, we being advocates for carbon dioxide removal, there is a huge, responsibility to educate the masses about what this is, what strategies CDR entails, what this means for people globally and domestically, and the role that CDR should play in a larger climate mitigation scenario. And so I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding that the public sector has because there hasn't been a lot of intentional education about the differences between these terms. So the public sector, as Delaney and both Seema brought up earlier, there's a lot of burdens that a lot of these communities already face. And so if I'm facing burdens, it's already really difficult for me to take the time out of my day to, search through academic articles, a lot of very high level information about why we need this technology or these strategies, and to decide the really subtle nuances between these terms. And then there is the side of the intentional conflation. So I think this comes from people who have an agenda, is I think the easiest way to say it. So the conflation that CDR is CCS is something that we hear really frequently. And oftentimes the point of this is to say CDR is bad for all of the same reasons that CCS is bad. And this isn't necessarily a conversation about CCS, so I won't get into all of that. But it really is pointing to a lot of the same issues that people know communities are already concerned by in terms of CCS. So this is fossil fuel industry involvement, a lack of mitigation or a lack of attention to other mitigation tactics. It's drawing attention or funding away from other climate solutions. And so a lot of this is the concern that we hear on the side of CCS. And so I think that when you are saying CDR is CCS, then that is a lot of what you're hearing is the same kind of concern being carried over. So I think it's really important to distinguish between the types of conflation, because I think that, public understanding is different than someone who has an intentional agenda. And so it's important to recognize that in order to decide what role advocates want to play moving forward. And it's really important to distinguish because these projects will be cited by or around or within communities. And so it's really important that the community has the best understanding possible because they are the decision makers, they are the co-creators of this process. And so misconstruing or not educating a community for whatever reason on a project means that they don't understand the details and implications that come with the project, including the full set of risks, benefits, the timeline, the impact, all things that people need to have an understanding of in order to make a good decision for themselves. And so the CDR space often wants to set itself apart from the CCS space because of this concern, because of the historical past, because of similar actors who kind of move between spaces. And so it's difficult in order to do that if there is a lack of understanding and there is intentional conflation because people have an agenda. And so I think that, from this conflation, we've seen this narrative of false solutions arise. And so I think many of us who interact in this space have heard that term that CDR is a false solution. And so it's unfortunate because the false solution term in itself is a really loaded term. I think it can be frustrating for advocates when they hear that CDR is a false solution because it kind of stops all point of contact. People don't want to talk after that. But I think what's really important is to unpack that term and really peel back the veil to understand what communities mean when they say that. And so this intentional conflation does a disservice to everyone, to advocates, to the public, to decision makers in this process. And so when people say false solution, you know, a lot of times what they're referring to is CDR as CCS, conflating the terms, is a lifeline for fossil fuels to continue producing products. And more importantly, as Delaney really started to get into in her discussion of capitalism, that they can gain revenue from producing these products. And because we know in a capitalistic society, money is power. And so therefore they can use these strategies to gain more power. And so that is really a lot of what the crux is of the term false solution, what people mean. It also, you know, connotes the concern of the inability of these solutions to address a real problem, that the climate crisis is a real problem, and that CDR, as I'm conflating it with CCS, is a false solution to that problem. And so a lot of times when communities are discussing this, many of them would rather see money, time, energy invested in strategies that seem more foolproof, strategies that, you know, have a really proven history, things we feel comfortable with, like wind and solar. And those of us who are in this space as CDR advocates understand that these exact same, you know, strategies went through a process like this, where people kind of second guessed them, you know, and where people were not necessarily supportive. And now they've reached this kind of comfort level in society where the public understands them for the most part. The public understands the benefits of them. The federal government has made the benefits clear. I know what I can get if I install solar panels on my house for the most part. I don't know what I benefit from if CDR gets installed near me. And so some of that is the responsibility of advocates of CDR have to be really clear about the benefits that these strategies are bringing to these communities. And I think that one of the biggest parts of this false solution narrative that we hear is that advocates are not communicating that this is a last mile strategy, that we have to mitigate, that we have to decarbonize as much as possible. And this isn't just an opportunity for people to kind of bypass the system. And I think that that truly is what communities are concerned with, because of all the reasons that Seema and Delaney discussed, that this historical harm, that my community is going to be a sacrifice zone moving forward because we're allowing this strategy to let people skate around the rules. And so, you know, as advocates moving forward and throughout this conversation, I hope we can really talk about how CDR isn't really supposed to be used that way, and that it really is a last mile legacy emissions tactic, and how that fits into this broader, you know, portfolio of climate solutions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart, for helping us just finalize setting the stage and for getting into a lot of the details about the messaging around carbon removal and how it's been used so far and who's been leading the charge. You alluded to the fact that the fossil fuel industry has primarily been, you know, investing in, researching and developing a lot of these technologies. But I think there's been a shift, especially with the recent X Prize competition that has come out, that's really helped a lot of startups get more involved in setting the stage for carbon removal. And so, Seema, I would love to pass it to you so that you could tell us a little bit more about how you think startups and private sector companies can best integrate equity and justice into the development and deployment of their projects. What does robust community engagement from the private sector look like? And how can project developers ensure community ownership in projects?
That's a really great question. So I think that there is so much space for the private sector to do better. I really do. You know, the environmental justice movement has historically really focused on government as decision makers. And I alluded to this in my opening remarks, right? That we do have a lot going on in government spaces for best practices by government agencies, by legislators, by judges on environmental justice and engaging with communities. We don't have as much out there on the private sector and thinking through how the private private sector might approach things. Okay. So my view on this is there's so much space to improve. And one of the areas that I think is really important is in transparency. Okay, this is a concept that comes up in the government space a lot as environmental justice advocates are pushing for government to do better, right? Transparency and the notion of transparency comes up a lot, right? And I think that transparency is different than this notion of education. I very much agree with Delaney and Dr. Stewart that education and the mission of education is really important. What I see, however, though, is that at the community level, particularly with the communities that I work with, right, there's a lot of suspicion as to who is educating them, right? And so I think to be thinking about education a little differently and thinking much more about the word transparency is really important for the corporate and business sector to be involved in, right? It's first and foremost, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's what I'm struggling with, right? Here are the decisions I need to be making. Like, here's what I hope to do. Here's why I can't quite get there. Here are the financial issues, the technical issues, right? Like that kind of transparency almost from the decision maker, right? Shows a little bit of I'm not sure, right? And when you open yourself up a little bit to that I'm not sure sort of perspective, as opposed to let me educate you because I'm the expert and I know what's best and I'm coming in to tell you how it is, right? If we take a different approach to say, I actually am not the expert. I could benefit from listening to you. I'm not here to educate you. Why don't you educate me? Right? I think that we're shifting the perspective on this notion of education to be much more of a conversation, right? Education tends to be one-sided. Let me educate you. What I'm proposing is to shift to be thinking much more about a conversation. And that starts with transparency, and that starts with opening up to being vulnerable, to not having all of the answers that you're educating somebody else on. And I think that's a really important place to start, because once you start thinking about communities as not people that need to be only educated, but can educate, right? And thinking about communities not only as helpless, but helpful, right? And thinking about communities not only as amateurs, but actually experts as well in their own experience and in the past and in what might or might not work in the future because they've been there, right? Is a really big shift, I think, in the approach, right? And so before even getting into kind of what comes next, I think that big picture shift is important for decision makers to be thinking about, right? And so once you're transparent about the new, it's actually a great opportunity, right? Like I'm not in it yet. I'm just sort of beginning this new project and I've got a bunch of things I'm trying to sort through. Let's have a conversation about it. I have found, right, that some of the ideas that community members bring on technical challenges, financial challenges, right, like job challenges, how to reach specific kinds of communities like Delaney's talking about. Not all communities are the same, right? How to reach certain individuals, how to reach certain kinds of communities where there's intersectionality on race and on income and on a whole lot of different factors, right? Go to the community for help on how to reach, on how to engage, right? On the technical concerns, on the financial concerns, on the environmental concerns, right? And suddenly, I think decision makers will see that there's not only one community, there's often multiple communities, right? They'll understand the leaders in those communities. They'll understand the history of the area, the cultural issues that, Delaney was talking about, which I think are really vital. And they'll understand also like where the gaps are in knowledge, because I think that's really what Dr. Stewart is getting to is this notion that there are pieces of knowledge that people are getting from various places, from the news, from the internet, from their neighbors down the street, right? Like, and that knowledge is coming from various sources. And so thinking about a conversation with communities, right, and listening first I think often helps us understand, right, this particular community has a gap in knowledge here, this community has a gap in knowledge there, how can I help to fill that gap, right? And so we're coming together with different knowledge sources, with different fears, with different concerns, with different ideas. And that, to me, that kind of conversation is something that just takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It takes being embedded in a place and learning and being open to learning yourself, as opposed to only going forward and educating somebody else as the expert first and foremost.
Thank you so much, Seema. I really love how much you spoke to community two-way engagement and learning from communities and really taking their expertise and their lived experience into consideration when developing projects. Delaney, I would love to turn it over to you because of your expertise in community engagement and education. What are current barriers for civil society engagement and leadership in carbon removal? And how could the private and public sectors better enable civil society actors to engage in the field? And how can the civil society shape governance and accountability for the carbon removal field moving forward?
Thank you, Vanessa. And I think I'm definitely going to piggyback off of what Seema said in terms of the private sector, especially. There's room to grow, and there are things that they could be doing more of. I am overjoyed to see the amount of funding that is going into the technical components of CDR, both within federal government, within the private sector. These millions of dollars are getting thrown out, right? So what I would really love to see in terms of helping civil society to engage is more funding to do this social work. So what are the social components? Is there social science research? Is it the education? Is it time and effort towards these conversations that Seema is talking about? These two-way conversations take time, and being able to compensate these communities this time is also a financial barrier, right? Like, we are, especially within the NGO space, trying to juggle a lot of these things that I think both the public and the private sector can be way more involved in. So could there be a prize for the social components? Could there be a prize to understand what the co-benefits are? Could there be a prize to how you engage in a creative way with the community? And where's the funding and opportunities for different groups to get involved with that beyond the smaller CDR sector that we're seeing today? So in terms of civil society shaping governance, I think really learning about how to advocate at the local level is really crucial. So what we do at F4CR is we have local chapters, and they get training on how to do things like have meetings with your local legislator, and developing that relationship, how to write op-eds, how to write letters to the editor, finding different ways to get involved locally so you can build this more grassroots movement from the ground up, and really ensuring that everyone's voices are being heard. So I would really recommend for those that are interested as a civil society getting engaged in that, to really start learning how to do these things at the local level and starting in that with that foundation, so we can really ensure that everyone's voices are heard in developing the future that we want to see.
Thank you so much, Delaney. And I think you spoke very well to what private and public sector can be doing. Touching more on the public sector, Dr. Stewart, I know in many other panels today, this conference will be covering the policy and regulatory space for carbon removal. Where do you think the federal government is right now with respect to integrating equity and justice into the federal investments and initiatives that have recently exploded in the field? And are there any big flags, in your opinion, that need to be rectified, as well as any positives that you would like to highlight across these investments and initiatives?
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I think that, exploded really is the right word. And I think if you've been in this space for at least the past couple of years, that really is the feeling that people have. And I think that, just as Delaney said, we're really trying to capitalize on this momentum moving forward. But at the same time, I want to remind people that sometimes when you get caught up in momentum, you leave integral things out. And so justice and equity is something that we just can't leave behind because we're caught up in the vision, or we're caught up in the momentum. If that vision doesn't include equity and justice, then it's not a complete vision. And so, to say that a little bit about what's been going on, I think that the federal government has been doing well to integrate equity and justice into these incentives and investments. So FECM programs that are specified for CDR are included in the Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of the benefits go directly to these communities. EPA just announced the Office of Environmental Justice and Civil Rights, which is really monumental. And we're hearing a lot from advocates about how this really is the first time that the phrasing environmental justice is seen in these bills and in these initiatives, that there is acknowledgement from this administration, from the federal government and these offices that, that justice is an integral piece of what we hope to do moving forward. So we'll see if the new office at EPA has direct work with CDR, but hopefully the presence of an office like this and the dedicated funding and dedicated staffing can help remedy other environmental problems that often these communities are also dealing with. And, so people can hopefully move a little bit beyond the false solution lens that CDR is not necessarily responsible for all of these types of injustices that they face, but hopefully remedying other issues in their communities can help them see CDR as this kind of vision for moving forward in the role that it might play in a larger suite of climate solutions. DOE is also working to integrate community engagement plans into their program work. There's a lot of conversation about what that looks like. And so DOE recently has requested that community benefit plans accompany all agency funding, and that when the funding announcements go out, the funding opportunity announcements, the FOAs, all go out for these projects like the DAC hubs, that people who are applying, companies that are applying, have to include these community benefit plans in their application. So just as much as we're talking about the technology itself, the strategy itself, the energy that is going to be supplied for this, the end use of the CO2, that communities are just as much a part of this, and that they're, going back to what Seema said, that there's transparency in all of this, that there's public accountability. So a lot of these community benefit plans will be published online, so people can see what a corporation has committed itself to when it becomes a part of one of these programs. So earlier in the year, the Center for Environmental Quality released guidelines around carbon management, where CDR was included under this larger umbrella of carbon management. And perhaps that is maybe ironic in the conversation about conflation between CCS and CDR, when even a government agency is saying, well, it's all carbon management and CDR falls under this as well. But we're seeing that even in the guidelines for carbon management, providing a net social benefit was stated in that is exactly what we're hoping to provide for communities, that what is the social benefit that you're adding? And I think that we really have to get into what these benefits are, what they mean to communities. And, just as Seema said, that this is a two-way learning process, or at least that's the way that it should be. And so what might be a benefit to a corporation is maybe not a benefit to the community. And I think that we really have to start having these open and transparent conversations. So hopefully these community benefits plans that companies are submitting are informed by actually talking to communities, and not just saying, this is my plan that I have for you when we come and we do this project. And just as Delaney said, that it's really important to consider what the community has been through, the history they've been through, to ascertain what benefits are, because oftentimes in this space we hear a lot about the workforce initiatives, as Delaney talked about earlier. And to a community that has maybe been employed in by the fossil fuel industry before, or maybe has dealt with other kinds of environmental injustices, a workforce may not be the same kind of benefit that a company thinks it is. So hopefully this kind of collaborative, transparent process that the government is really pushing moving forward can help us clearly draw guidelines and create a process that is, these universal guidelines that apply to very specific logistics of processes. And I think that's kind of the challenge that the government is facing, is when a project isn't one size fits all, how can the rules be one size fits all? And so I think really, as we talk about big flags that need to be rectified, there isn't necessarily any one thing that I would point to and say DOE is doing this incorrectly, or, the federal government is doing this incorrectly. But I think that, once again, we talk about education being a two-way street. Delaney, made an excellent point about funding in these areas, that we're seeing a lot on the technology side, and there's a lot of robust policy conversation happening. But is that policy conversation trickling down to the communities? Do communities really understand what's written in these policies and what a program entails for their community? There's a lot of questions that communities have about risk. There's a lot of, unanswered questions that communities have that, the government can step in and fill that space. There should be opportunities for communities to ask the government question, for there to be studies that are commissioned based on the curiosities that communities have. And once again, it should be accessible. It should be transparent. There's a lot that goes into those words. We need clear rubrics with principles that are based on Justice 40, that are based on the 17 principles of environmental justice, that are created through public iterative processes, so the public can say, I helped create this rubric. This is what I want for my community, and this is what I want from companies, and as well as experts in EJ practices. We need really clear definitions about what we expect in major infrastructure. If you have been privy to some of the conversations about DOE and the DAC hubs, there's a lot of conversation about what a DAC hub is. Do we know what that is? I think there needs to be a lot around definitional language and clarifying that and being clear with communities. There's a lot of questions about power supply for these big types of projects. And once again, what are the benefits that we're bringing to communities? Also, I would say that the lack of staff to execute programming is something that there are concerns that communities have. So it's great to create these offices. I think we're seeing a really robust movement from federal offices, but are they staffed adequately? Do they have the funding internally to be able to do this work and execute it and pay attention to these really, really fine details? And so overall, I think that we are seeing a monumental change coming from the federal government and coming from the administration to say environmental injustice is real, and what are we going to do to remedy this? And I think even that acknowledgement coming from the government, that acknowledgement in language, in IIJA, in the IRA, seeing those things is, validating to communities to say, this is someone recognizing that there is a problem that's been created and trying to come up with solutions to fix it. And so I think, we definitely have to acknowledge that as a positive. And I think that there's a lot of really positive buzz coming around these programs and these announcements. As Delaney and Seema both mentioned, the private sector has a real opportunity here to collaborate with public programming in order to do some real good for communities. So I do think that overall the momentum is very excited, but in all of that, we have to make sure that, equity and justice are core tenets of how we're evaluating these programs moving forward.
Thank you for that overview, Dr. Stewart. It sounds like there's a lot of great progress that's being made, but still a long way for us to go, for all three sectors to be playing together. I have one last question for y'all before we get into the audience Q&A, which I can see questions are lining up already. But we've spent a lot of time getting into the specifics of how the carbon removal field should be scaled. And as a final question for each of the panelists, I would love to know, what do we risk if carbon removal doesn't go forward from both a domestic lens and an international lens? And following that, for each of you, what does an equitable and just carbon removal future look like to you, where you feel confident that carbon removal is delivering community benefits and centering the needs of frontline communities? Can it advance any current environmental justice and climate justice priorities, like a just economic transition or a regenerative agricultural system? And maybe I will pass it to Seema to start us off.
Thanks, Vanessa. This is a great question. And I guess what I will say is that I think what's really important is to think about the new and shiny thing as being something that is actually going to be sustaining in long term. I think with new and shiny things, we tend to be very excited, and we tend to be at the forefront of thinking about the new and shiny thing. To me, what actually is important to do, however, is to think about what was the new and shiny thing 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, and where did that new and shiny thing at that point end up today? And I think when we think about that from a historical lens on what used to be new and shiny and what went wrong with the new and shiny, it will help this community in the world of CDR think about what they want to be able to say 20 years from now, 50 years from now, at some point in the future, right? And so part of me thinks that, for example, right, Dr. Stewart just alluded to community benefit plans, right? We don't want it to be a situation like we've seen in the environmental context in the past, right? Where there is a plan and the plan is well-intentioned, and the government requires a plan from the business sector. We have seen this in the past. And the plan is submitted and government says, yes, check the box, plan is submitted, good to go. 10 years later, the plan was not enforced. 15 years later, even though it's on the website, no one's checking because no one can find it because it's buried at the bottom. Or guess what? That web page is no longer an active link. Okay, I've seen this happen in the environmental context in many situations that involve grants, that involve permits, that involve licenses, right? Where there is a plan to do a good job on behalf of the community, and 10, 20, 50 years later, there's all kinds of problems. And so my thought would be, Vanessa, is to learn from what the new shiny penny was on multiple other instances, and learn what did or didn't work and try to do better time around, right? Try to make community benefit plans actually enforceable. Try to make a way so that there is a check-in process, that there is a long-term monitoring of those plans to make sure that those benefits are actually achieved, right? So I do think that that is an example in the community benefit plan world where we can try to be thinking long-term about those plans. But in so many aspects of CDR, I think what we want to be doing, right, is thinking about the future and looking back and going, what do we want to have achieved, right? And we do that by learning, right, from the past.
Thank you so much, Seema, for those final thoughts. I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Stewart.
Yeah, I think first of all, just really echoing and applauding everything that Seema just said. I think that oftentimes we ask ourselves as advocates in this space, what is the risk if this doesn't go forward? Because I think we feel like there's a lot of pushback that comes from oftentimes this conflation of CDR and CCS being the same thing and the ills of CCS being the ills of CDR. And I think first of all, we can mitigate all we want, we can decarbonize all we want, and we should. I just really want to reiterate and echo that point that the role that CDR should play is addressing legacy emissions. But at the end of the day, if we do everything right, if we decarbonize tomorrow, there would still be a role for CDR. And I think that ultimately, if CDR doesn't move forward, we risk leaving a tool behind in the toolbox. And I think that the thing that we have to recognize, and we didn't quite get into it in this conversation, but the role of the United States as a Western country, as part of the global North, is to remedy harm that we've contributed to that is global, because we only have one climate that we all share. And so I think that we also risk being able to not provide benefit to our own country, but to contribute to this larger global conversation that we also have responsibility. So we have responsibility to communities in the United States, but we also have responsibility to global communities because of how we have participated in the creation of this problem. And so I think that the risk is much more than just kind of a you and me thing, but we have to think very globally about the role that the US plays in the solution to addressing this problem. As far as the future that I would like to see moving forward with CDR, I would like to see a future that includes democratic principles governing CDR as it moves forward. And in these principles, I would want them to be informed by communities, informed by environmental justice history and experts, people who live and work in these spaces. And I would also like to see CDR address broader socioeconomic issues. I think that really we're at this crossroads where a lot of the CDR community is very siloed. We're very focused on the strategy and the deployment of this strategy. But as you know, Seema and Delaney have really spoken to today, there's so much more that's interacting in society. There's so much more of the socioeconomic issues and how they interact with climate that can just not be teased apart and should not be teased apart from how we create solutions. And so I would really love to see CDR as a space that has these democratic principles, that addresses broader socioeconomic issues. I would love for CDR to be a space that's co-created with communities and informed by them. I think we could really just cannot, give enough poignance to what Seema said about this being a two-way iterative process where it is hopefully going forward a marriage of expertises and not one type of expertise dominating. And usually that's the technical expertise, the scientific expertise dominating people's values and people's lived experiences. And I think all encompassing in that is I would love to see that policy moving forward in a sector moving forward that is reflective of people, not of industry. And, in saying that, I would hope to see one that can withstand administration changes. When Seema was talking about moving forward in the future that we want to create something sustainable and long lasting. And that's really the vision, hopefully, that I have for CDR moving forward. I would love to see innovation grow and develop in this space. I think it's a space where that can happen. And ultimately, I would love to see it be a space that doesn't benefit extractive industries moving forward, a space that really is centered on restoring justice to communities that deserve that, and communities that have been speaking on these issues for a really long time and really can be validated through this process of considering them and putting them first.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart, for that vision. And lastly, I'll pass it over to Delaney before starting with audience questions.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I think both panelists definitely alluded to a lot of what I will speak on, but I kind of think about, so in terms of the moral hazard discussion, we often hear that this moral hazard, that if we pursue CDR, that we're not going to do the very necessary work of reducing our emissions, of getting off of fossil fuels and adjusting to this changing climate. But ultimately, I mean, as much as we do need to really consider this is a very real concern, I think first and foremost, demonstrating solidarity with other movements in terms of reducing emissions and adjusting to the changing climate and finding ways to support the just transition and finding all these ways to support the food justice movement and all these different ways will really show solidarity from the CDR community going into other movements and really showing that this is not the only thing we're focusing on. And then I think I would kind of reiterate, so the IPCC has said in the most recent report in April that CDR is now an essential component of limiting warming to 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So it is no longer that this is something we're considering because we're thinking about it and it's something that we're planning for in the future, which would also do ourselves a disservice to not be planning all our options and to really be researching these and starting these conversations early on with any option we have. So really thinking about now with this shift in terms of the level at which we in the past failed to get off of fossil fuels and to reduce our emissions, we're now seeing a higher level of the need for CDR. And it's not a need without reducing the emissions, it's a need with. So now I think it's more of a conversation of how we're going to do this. And in terms of what we risk if we don't do it, and the way I see it is kind of a reverse moral hazard. So as much as it would be a moral hazard to just pursue CDR, it would also be a moral hazard to not do so. For the communities in the global South, for the communities within the US who are experiencing climate change right now, to give them the options of the people in small island states. What are we doing for these people that are having this happen now and addressing what has already happened? And we definitely, in terms of the fossil fuel engagement, it is not a write-off for fossil fuels to continue not reducing their emissions and not doing this necessary work. So finding ways within, whether it's policy, whether it's in what the private sector is funding, within all these different opportunities to not just be benefiting, or not really at all benefiting, the fossil fuel companies, and thinking about putting these communities first and making that your priority instead of offering this opportunity for that write-off. So in whatever way we can show solidarity is gonna, I think, build trust from different sectors and different movements to know that we are having the right mindset in terms of deploying CDR. And then in terms of what I would love to see, I always go back to the form of reparations. Ever since I heard it first and foremost, and thinking about the way that we could integrate different movements, we have a huge opportunity of the statistics. In a lot of ways, we're still learning about a lot of them and gathering data on this, but we do have a starting point for who has been the historical contributors to climate change, and in more ways than one, not just the emissions in our atmosphere, but in the social components and the injustice components. So I think we have this idea of reparations now, and I would really love to see collaboration to developing what that actually looks like, co-created with communities. What would be a meaningful form of reparations within the context of CDR, and how can we support that within the US, and how can we support that more broadly as an international movement? So as we continue these conversations, of course, we have the local level and we're seeing the federal level within the US, but really thinking of this global North, global South dynamic and how we can best support the communities who are experiencing climate change right now. And then ultimately, I would also hope to see the communities who are most disproportionately affected being those primary beneficiaries to these co-benefits. So of course, we want everyone to have co-benefits, and especially non-climate co-benefits, but we have to realize that these communities, in terms of being well equipped to face the next 50 years, 100 years, and so forward, that they have the resources beyond just cash transfers. So what social systems are we redeveloping? What democratic systems are we redeveloping? Is there new ways of decision making to decide how the money is allocated? Is there ways of decision making to decide how we decide on policy and who gets that say? So really thinking about this idea of world making within this global context and what role CDR can play, and getting very critical and conversational early on to develop this type of program.
Thank you so much, Delaney, and thank you everyone for sharing your thoughts and vision for what a responsible carbon removal field can look like. Taking a look at audience questions that are rolling in, I would like to continue on the topic of moral hazard, which I know Delaney and everyone spoke to a bit already. I can see that both Will and Dan have asked about moral hazard, and specifically I would like to elevate the point. While we understand that carbon removal is required in addition to emissions reductions in order to meet our global and domestic climate goals, how can government funding of carbon removal do more than enrich portions of the private sector and shield polluters when there remains no associated or parallel mandates to, one, rapidly phase out emissions, and two, actually remove or pay to remove legacy emissions for which a major polluter is responsible? Dr. Stewart, I may start with you because of your expertise in federal policy, but please, everyone else, feel welcome to hop in as well.
Yeah, thank you. And firstly, I would like to say to Dan that this is a really good question. And it is a question that comes up a lot. I think one of the ways to look at it is that, one, we can say that it's the enriching portions of the private sector is true, but there's a lot of new innovation that is being invested in right now. And so hopefully, part of my vision and what I would like to see moving forward is that some of these startup companies that Seema talked about earlier, and some of these newer these newer groups that are receiving funding are diverse thinkers from diverse backgrounds that are willing to contribute to this larger kind of idea of democratic principles, that it's not necessarily just funding the kind of incumbent actors that we've seen, but it's also providing funding for new breakthrough thinking and these kind of more democratic perspectives to move forward. And so hopefully those are the groups that we would like to see rise to the top. The last thing I'll say about it is that CDR and the policy is not just happening in a vacuum at the federal level. A lot of times when people are advocating for CDR and the policies and the funding, they're also doing so with conversations that are really difficult to have in the federal government about carbon taxes, about carbon pricing. And so I think once again, this kind of alludes to how CDR fits into this larger conversation around climate solutions, and how we really will miss the mark if we only focus on CDR and only focus on what CDR can bring. And I think that we're seeing a lot of this kind of get out of jail free card of being able, or the concern of being able to pollute and still reap the benefits of participating in CDR practices because of the actors that are participating in both sectors. And so I think, there has to be a lot more of a conversation as we move forward about shaping this space and who should be participating in this space and who should be participating in the creation of policy in this space. And so in a very ideal world, I think Delaney did a great job earlier talking about the roles of patriarchy and capitalism and colonialism. In an ideal world, polluters would have to pay for what they did, literally, and create a fund that then could be used for a myriad of other solutions. But there are a lot of people on Capitol Hill. There's a lot of conversations happening in the NGO space about how we can do that moving forward, what carbon taxes, what carbon pricing looks like, carbon border adjustments and agreements, what they look like. And so I would just caution everyone to remember that the funding that's coming from the federal government is a lot, but it is just a piece of this larger puzzle.
I'll chime in here as well, Vanessa. I largely agree with what Dr. Stewart's talking about on the carbon side. I just want to talk for a minute about the other side of this question, which is the emissions cutting side, which I think is important to think through as well, because there's a lot of conversation that's not perfect in the emissions cutting side too. And I think that that's really important to acknowledge, right? So there's, I think, a lot of conversations about who benefits and who's profiting in, for example, the EV space, the electric vehicle space, right? And the push to sort of cut emissions and the need to move people into electric cars. There are justice elements to that. There's profit issues in that space as well, right? So I do think that in multiple other sectors in which we are trying to cut emissions, there are a whole lot of issues going on with respect to profit and with respect to justice and with respect to who benefits. I also think that this concept of sort of extending the life of fossil fuels has been had before in other spaces involving that emissions cutting side, right? I worked for a long time when I was at EPA on NAAQS pollutants, National Ambient Air Quality Standard pollutants, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, PM, which are all coming from the same type of sources that are also emitting carbon dioxide, right? And so in cutting other kinds of air pollutants, right, you might require as government for a particular facility, a large smokestack, to invest a ton of money into a filter, right, which is going to mitigate the amount of pollution coming out of that filter. But investment in that filter also extends the life of that smokestack and that factory to continue moving forward, right? So I do think this kind of conversation about extension of life of fossil fuels and bridging and getting, baby steps, and this kind of concept has come up before and is continuing to come up in that emissions cutting side as well. And so in both spaces of sort of the carbon space and the climate space, as well as the emissions cutting space, I think we have something to learn from the attempts to cut emissions in the non-carbon dioxide space, but in the global air pollution space that has been done many times, particularly the conversations that have been happening on the mobile source side of air pollution as well, which I think are largely very similar to what's happening here in the electric vehicle space, in the public rail space. There's a lot happening in the mobile source sector that I think is really relevant.
And I'll just
Delaney,
jump in
please.
there. Yeah, thank you. I think both of Seema and Simone alluded to a lot of what I'll get to, so I'll keep it brief. But in terms of these mandates that Dan had a great question about, absolutely. I think these are necessary things within the context of legacy emissions for which polluters are most responsible. This is a conversation that needs to happen not just within the federal government, but within all global governments. So perhaps a conversation at COP. But I know they're starting conversations, and also we really need to think about one, the data. So we have an idea of like the US being one of the major polluters, but also within the US, like types of polluters. And I think that differs on socioeconomic status and differs within the companies versus the individuals within the country. So I think developing a really robust plan and research beyond just countries and really thinking about the different dynamics within the country themselves to ensure that when we are deploying this, that it's meaningful and that it is ultimately, as Seema alluded to earlier, having this collaboration and conversational two-sided development option. So not just us deciding that we know the major polluters are responsible and now we're going to put a federal policy to it, but really going within the communities who are least responsible and understanding what that looks like for them in terms of developing policies and developing international agreements that can meet them in a way that is meaningful. So definitely something that needs to happen, but also something that there's a little more movement that needs to happen throughout the international space to ensure that when it happens, that it doesn't fall short in ways that we have seen in the past.
Thank you all for your thoughts on that question. We've been referencing a lot responsible polluters, and I would like to raise a question that Corbin mentioned in the chat, that throughout this panel, we've separated the carbon removal field from the oil and gas industry. And I think they are a huge elephant in the room that, as our panelists have alluded to, cause skepticism with environmental justice communities and frontline communities and groups with regards to these technologies. But as Corbin raises, the oil and gas industry has decades of expertise. They have lots of infrastructure and knowledge around carbon removal technologies that could be really useful in scaling up these solutions. And so for the panelists, how can or should carbon removal companies work with and potentially benefit from oil and gas companies while also separating themselves from the industry? Who should decide what role oil and gas industry should be playing in the scale up of carbon removal? What do we risk maybe by having them involved? Maybe we can start with Dr. Stewart again.
Yeah, sure. I think, first of all, Corbin, this is a really great question and something that I think that we were hoping to tackle a little bit more in our conversation. And so, thank you for asking. I think it really is, important to start with the acknowledgement that the oil and gas industry, fossil fuel industry at large, has really contributed to the advancement of both the CCS and the CDR communities. And so I think that, there is a lot of knowledge and information sharing that can be done between these fossil fuel industries that are participating in CDR in this way, and the new kind of innovative startups and ideas that I kind of alluded to earlier. I think it's also important to acknowledge that the way that their technology has advanced, their projects will likely be some of the first that are off the ground. And so what I really think is important to hone in on in that regard is that fossil fuel companies that are invested in this have the opportunity to set a standard. And, I think that there is a lot of very nuanced perspective that goes into this conversation. I think there's a lot of people that would love to say fossil fuel industry should have no business in CDR, that they shouldn't be allowed to be involved, they shouldn't decide policy. But I think that from a perspective of understanding how far the conversation is along and how far their participation is in the conversation and in the deployment activity, I think that looking from a realistic perspective, they have an opportunity to set the standard for engagement and for what good CDR looks like. And once again, I want to acknowledge that there are perfectly valid perspectives from a lot of communities that, would say that is that's hypocritical, that a fossil fuel company cannot do good CDR just by the definition of historically what fossil fuel companies have done in the US. So I do want to acknowledge and validate that perspective, because I think communities do have a lot of valid concerns about the participation of the fossil fuel industry. But I do think these industries have the power to execute. They have the power and the resources and money to execute these democratic principles that we're talking about to benefit this social change that is a larger conversation than just carbon dioxide removal. They have the ability to help use their influence in legislation to decide what good CDR is and how to punish bad actors that don't fall within the realm of what the guidelines are. You know, maybe that's wishful thinking that this is a leverage point for fossil fuel communities to start the reparations process, or fossil fuel companies to start the reparation process. Maybe this is a step for how they go forward, and it's a turning point. You know, I think that when we talk about the role of fossil fuel industries in CDR, I think a lot of what communities are worried about is the extractive nature of these industries. It's really hard to say that you're doing good CDR when at the same time you're extracting and continuing to create even emissions that will then be recycled. There's a lot of conversation about net zero oil and a lot of conversation about the role of CCS and all of this. And so I think that it's important to acknowledge that there are things that we can learn. There is a huge infrastructure that the fossil fuel industry has created that is really going to be married into CDR moving forward. But I think that we have to at the same time acknowledge that communities have been hurt by extractive industries, and Delaney alluded to many ways outside of just the emissions perspective, but the injustices that come with fossil fuel and extractive industries. And the industry still stands to make money off of the solution. And oftentimes from what we're seeing in these really early stages, making money at the expense of the taxpayer. And so really that is a larger conversation, I think. But I think that what people don't want to see is the unfair growth or undue benefit to these industries if they are leaders. I think, you know, revisiting the point I made earlier that in a capitalist system, money is power. And so what communities are worried about is that this power will not be used at this turning point for good, but that it will be used as a continual harm for communities because the bottom line is more important to these industries than people. So I think, you know, maybe in the more wishful thinking category, that this is a real turning point, a pivotal point for these industries who are going to be breaking ground, whether many of us like it or not. And it's a chance for them to do right and, you know, break the status quo going forward. So, you know, getting rid of these harmful practices, addressing their history, addressing injustices. And so I think that people that are in the more innovative space can learn from these industries because, like I said, they are very far ahead, but at the same time, learn from their practices to help create their principles moving forward. And ultimately, I think just as history has shown us, those that follow the principles that are best for society will set themselves apart.
I'll chime in here as well. And I think what I would add to that sort of excellent remarks, big picture, is to go back to what I discussed a little earlier in the conversation, which is the role of listening. I really do think that there is a missing link in the fossil fuel sector in particular to validating and listening to communities, right? I think that there is this notion that we've got a lot of NIMBYs, and there's a notion that we've got a lot of people that are, you know, here to complain writ large. And when we go in to any conversation, right, I'm going back to that word conversation, with prejudgments about what the community is bringing or what the community is saying, right, we automatically are shutting off that conversation, right? But I do think that there is an opportunity for the fossil fuel sector to be forward thinking here. I am amazed by the number of environmental justice talks I am doing to the fossil fuel sector writ large. I do think that is coming at demand from shareholders. It's coming at demand from employees. It's coming from pressure in multiple different spaces, but there is an opportunity to take that and move forward, right? Don't just listen to me or the quote unquote experts, but listen to the communities too, and go into those spaces without the prejudgments, right? And sometimes it is something simple. Like I had spent a lot of time listening to recordings of, you know, the listening sessions that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has been doing, right? Those are fascinating. We've got community members that are out there talking to FERC about what they see on the ground living next to a compressor station or some other sort of natural gas or oil and gas facilities out west. And so I do think that taking time to listen in multiple different capacities, sometimes of which is just literally turning on a recording and listening to the multiple listening sessions that government agencies are doing, really helps identify what is it that this community is concerned about, right? What are their worries? Going back to that notion of environmental being really, really broad. You can see that communities are talking about concerns about health, but also concerns about safety, right? And concerns also about well-being. I mean, concerns about affordability, concerns about threats to agricultural lands and lands that are nearby, cultural properties, historic properties that they value. I mean, there's just a myriad of concerns that you'll find communities that are bringing up to agencies like FERC in FERC's listening sessions, and being able to understand and listen and go, these are valid, these are really important, right? And they're also complex, and they're also diverse in their concerns, right? I think is a really good starting place.
And I'll just add there, I think for me, what comes up is there's a rightful distrust of these fossil fuel companies from these communities who have experienced this. So as Seema really alluded to, really listening and understanding where people are coming from, especially if you don't have that lived experience. So I think there definitely, as much as we can hope of what we want to see, which Simone definitely alluded to, there definitely needs to be this like set of democratic principles, and they do have a very real opportunity to lead the way. There also definitely needs to be some sort of safeguard to protect these communities who are very concerned, to ensure that they are being heard and listened to and considered within this. And there is an accountability on the fossil fuel companies to actually do what we're hoping and what they should do. And then, yeah, really just understanding, of course, as both Seema and Simone alluded to, they do have these resources. So allowing the communities to decide what type of engagement there is going to be, what that engagement looks like, and ensuring that it is the communities first and foremost that are benefiting, rather than these fossil fuel companies just because they are ready to deploy for all the reasons that we all know. So really ensuring that if we're going to do this, there is a safe place for these communities to be heard and be understood. And then there's the accountability and the acknowledgement and the validation within these fossil fuel companies that are getting involved or are already involved in CDR and CCS to really lead the way and acknowledge the past harms that they have done onto these communities.
Thank you so much, all. Will, I see you're coming off of mute. Is it time to wrap up?
No, we've got a little bit longer. I just coming in.
All right, great. Well then, that being said, I would like to combine a couple of questions from Emily and Ilya that are in the chat regarding public engagement. I think that's been a theme that's come up a lot throughout our conversation today. And Seema, I would love to start with you just because of all the work that you've done in this space, but what are best practices for balancing the slower timeline needed for effective community engagement processes with the rapid timeline needed for scaling carbon removal and a lot of other climate technologies? And that being said, could you also point us to any specific projects that you think have done a good job in engaging communities and establishing that two-way dialogue and empowering communities and enabling some of that community ownership that we've talked about?
Great questions. So I would say on the first, I think this is a real tough one on timelines. I do. I think that, you know, by definition, community engagement takes a long time. And by definition, developers of all kinds want to move quick. Right. And we see this that pops up in the space of land use a lot. I do a lot in the space of land use. And this is a topic that is forever pressing, right? Developers of all kinds want to hurry up. Okay. They want to hurry up for a variety of reasons. Sometimes It's a noble reason, like climate change is pressing, right? But sometimes it's also another noble reason, which is we want to create jobs and we want to do it fast, right? Sometimes it's another noble reason if we want to stabilize the electricity grid because there's blackouts, right? There's multiple noble reasons as to why we want to hurry up and develop. Okay. And so, but I really do think that we got to slow it down. And I do think that, and the reason we slow it down is it might feel like a slowdown right now, and that's frustrating. But I think what happens when we slow it down a little bit to actually engage at the beginning and to start a two-way dialogue at the beginning, right? What we see is that it actually is more successful in the long term, which should be the goal. It shouldn't be the shiny new penny that we just want to get going, right? It should be that we actually want it to work long term. I'll say that again, long term. Okay. I do think that's the important part, right? It's sort of is like, you just kind of got to keep at it. And it's not just a one-time thing, a conversation. It's not a two-time thing. It's a continual thing over the course of many, many years. And I'll tell you, people get tired. People get tired. And in year 5 and in year 10, right, you're tired because that conversation is perpetual, right? I think of the dialogues, to be honest, that I have with my 14-year-old, and I am tired at times, right? Like I really am. It's like, haven't we had this conversation? And I mean, but it's a lifelong thing, right? It happens. And that is, to me, it's not sort of which one comes first, like, and it's not really that way. When you think of it as a conversation, it's like the two are in parallel track for the life of the project, right? At the beginning, the middle, the sticky points, the problems in which you have to like scale back because you didn't get the funding here or you didn't get the funding there, or there's a glitch, right? Like it is running on parallel track. That's the point. So I want to sort of like reframe the question a little bit to not assume that there has to be a first or a second, right? Or that there has to be this notion of delay, right? Because the notion of delay means like, well, delay for what? Like, are we talking short term, medium term, long term? Like, what do we mean by delay? Okay. And so that's what I want to do in sort of thinking about that first question. And the second question, Vanessa, on who's doing a good job. I think everyone's trying. And when I say everyone, I mean like writ large, the environmental community in lots of spaces related to climate change. I think everyone's trying, okay, to be that one that is going to be the model. All right. And so what I would say, particularly to the business and corporate sector and developers, in whether you're in the EV space and the carbon removal space, I mean, really, and in the world of climate and trying to advance climate, is if you think you're doing a good job, be transparent about it. What worked and what didn't work, right? What did you try and where did you fail? Right? Like, and also, who are you asking? Right? Like, from whose perspective is it a good job? Like, it's not really my job to come here and tell everybody listening here what I think was a good job, right? Like, it's really the community in a particular project, right? That it's their perspective that I would ask. It's not mine.
Thank you so much. I think your response will be very helpful for so many trying to figure out what good community engagement looks like. We're very short on time. There's one last question I would like to elevate for Dr. Stewart specifically. This is a question from Shannon. Could you speak more to how closely tied clean or renewable energy should be in scaling carbon removal technologies? I think renewable energy is a really clear environmental justice priority of frontline communities. And I think in really having net negative carbon removal, this will be essential. So could you just speak really briefly to the importance of this before we wrap things up?
Yeah, of course. And I mean, I think that you kind of said it, or Shannon kind of said it, that, you know, we talk a lot about the logistics of deployment, but one thing that we don't talk a lot about is what's going to power a lot of these solutions, the more technological CDR solutions. And for them to truly be a net negative strategy, they have to be powered by renewable energy. And so this is one of those this is kind of, an example of what I was alluding to earlier in saying that if we only focus on CDR, we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're doing communities a disservice. That CDR fits into this larger picture. And so part of that larger picture is the robust deployment of renewables. And as Seema mentioned earlier with the issue of emissions, that renewables come with their own kind of questions and their own caveats. And so for us to be aware across the board and for CDR thinkers to be thinking about those types of questions as well, to figure out how CDR fits into a larger ecosystem of clean energy. But we definitely will need the robust deployment of clean energy, which means we're going to need more transmission build out. Seema talked about NIMBYs. I think, transmission is kind of like the next frontier that we're going to be moving into, having these questions when we talk about creating robust grids that are going to be able to take the massive amount of energy that is going to be generated and created. And I think this is a great opportunity too, when we're talking about these projects, to talk about co-siting. Is there a way that you don't have to transfer that energy over really long distances? Can you build these solutions next to clean energy sources? Talking about communities and their really specific needs, like looking at microgrids and the robustness of those to keep communities going, and also figuring how that works into the CDR infrastructure. So I think, kind of wrapping everything up that we've talked about today, it's been a really wonderful discussion, but really thinking of CDR as this future space that has to acknowledge a past and think about where it wants to go sustainably and long term, and really being a solution and tool for communities. It requires thinking in a much larger scale than just the really cool technology, just the questions about deployment and build out. We really have to see CDR as a piece of a larger ecosystem. And when we pour the effort, energy, time, money into creating that larger sustainable ecosystem, then I think that we'll see CDR thrive within that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stewart, for that answer. And thank you so much, Delaney, Dr. Stewart, Seema, for sharing your insights and expertise with us today on this panel. And thank you to the audience for tuning in and engaging so thoughtfully with the panelists. All the questions were really amazing. I wish we could have covered more of them. I hope this session has left everyone feeling really energized for achieving a responsible and robust carbon removal field that will uplift frontline communities and address the climate crisis head on. Thank you all again, and please enjoy the rest of the conference. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Will.
All right. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you to all of you for an excellent panel. This is an issue of particular interest to me, and I think there are a number of themes that are really important for us to carry forward. One of it is this role of this reflexive process, right? And I don't think we're there yet, quite frankly. The CDR community, I think, to its credit, is increasingly acknowledging that environmental justice is an important issue, but in some ways trying to define it itself without engaging as much as is necessary with communities of color and others that face vulnerabilities, both in terms of climate change and in terms of the potential implications of deploying carbon removal at a large scale. And I think conversely, the environmental justice community has not adequately engaged with the CDR community in acknowledging a potentially critical role of CDR in actually comporting with the values of environmental justice if done correctly, right? And so I'm hoping that there are more opportunities for actual dialogue in the communities. And I think some groups, Carbon 180, the Institute for Carbon Removal, are trying to start scaffolding those exercises, and I'm hoping that members of both of the respective communities are amenable to engaging in that dialogue. I think this issue of there being potentially different interests of the international environmental justice community or the environmental justice community in the South, and that in perhaps the United States, and the need to acknowledge that creates another complicated permutation, but a critical one that again I hope is being discussed more in the future. And the 10,000-pound elephant in the room of the role of the fossil fuel industry, right, in all of this is a really interesting one, right? Because in my opinion, the fossil fuel industry has earned the distrust of the environmental justice community, honestly, as paradoxically, and so it's understandable. But at the same time, as you've pointed out, the fossil fuel industry has a lot of the necessary expertise that can help us in facilitating this. And quite frankly, if we want to cut the Gordian knot of the politics of making this happen, if there is an economic motive for the fossil fuel industry to cooperate in this context, it may help us a lot, right? So figuring out how to reconcile all those confusing elements is a challenge, but it's one that I think is critical if we're going to do this in a way that's both politically viable and is ethical and just, right? Which I think we obviously all agree in this community is critical. So I really thank you for highlighting a lot of those issues.